My parents stole my $45,000 future to favor brother. Dad sparked hate campaign labeling me selfish and kicked me with nothing. Years later, brother needed liver. I refused until I dragged them to our old house. Truth broke my father's pride and forced his confession. Hey everyone, welcome back to Vance Rock Stories. Before we get into today's story, I want to ask you something. If your family took away the one opportunity that was meant for you and gave it to someone else, would you ever truly forgive them? And if years later those same people came back needing your help, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy real-life family drama stories with difficult choices, betrayals, and emotional twists, make sure to subscribe. Now let me tell you what happened. My name is Lena Harper. I'm 29 years old, and for the first time in my life, I had reached a place where things felt stable. Not perfect, just stable. I worked as a licensed physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic outside Denver. My days were predictable. Patients came in, patients left stronger, and I went home, tired but satisfied. I liked it that way. There was something comforting about knowing what tomorrow would look like. Most evenings, I'd stop at the same coffee shop on my way home. Same order, same corner table if it was available. A quiet life, a life I built myself. Nobody handed it to me, nobody rescued me, and definitely nobody in my family helped me get there. The truth was, I hadn't spoken to most of them in years. Not real conversations anyway. There were occasional birthday texts from my mother, sometimes a holiday message. Most of them went unanswered. It sounds cold, I know. But after enough disappointment, silence starts feeling safer than hope. That Thursday started like any other. I spent most of the day helping an older patient recover after knee replacement surgery. By 6 o'clock, I was exhausted. I got home, kicked off my shoes, and was halfway through heating leftovers when my phone started vibrating on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen, then froze. Ethan, my younger brother. For a second, I honestly thought I was seeing things. Ethan never called. Not on birthdays, not on holidays, not when Grandpa died, not even when Mom had surgery 3 years earlier. Nothing. The last real conversation we'd had was almost a decade ago. I let the phone ring. It stopped. A few seconds later, it rang again. Same name. Ethan. I stared at it. My first thought wasn't concern. It was suspicion. What could he possibly want? Money? A favor? An apology that was 10 years late? The ringing continued. Finally, I answered. Hello? For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard breathing. Heavy breathing. Ethan? His voice came through weak and strained. Lena. I immediately sat down. Something sounded wrong. Very wrong. What's going on? Another pause. Then he gave a short laugh that didn't sound like a laugh at all. I wasn't sure you'd answer. Neither was I. He didn't respond. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then I heard what sounded like a machine beeping somewhere in the background. My stomach tightened. Ethan, where are you? I'm at St. Matthew's. I frowned. The name sounded familiar. Then it clicked. St. Matthew's Medical Center. A hospital. Every defensive thought in my head suddenly shifted. What happened? His breathing grew heavier. It's complicated. Then uncomplicated. Another long silence. I almost thought the call had dropped. Then he finally spoke. I'm sick. I leaned forward. Sick how? No answer. Ethan. His voice cracked. Liver failure. The words hit harder than I expected. I hadn't planned on feeling sympathy, but hearing those words out loud was different, because no matter what had happened between us, he was still my brother. What do you mean, liver failure? The doctors say it's advanced. Advanced? They've been monitoring it for a while. A while. That phrase irritated me instantly. A while? Yeah. How long is a while? He hesitated. Years. I closed my eyes. Years. And somehow, this was the first time I was hearing about it. I wanted to ask 100 questions. Instead, I asked the simplest one. Why are you calling me now? The beeping in the background continued. When he answered, his voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Because for the first time since I'd picked up, he sounded scared. Really scared. Lena. Another pause. Then he said quietly, because the doctors don't think we have much time left. I gripped the edge of the chair. The room suddenly felt very still. And before I could respond, Ethan took a shaky breath and said, "The family needs your help." I didn't answer. I just sat there staring at my kitchen counter while those words echoed in my head. Not I need your help. Not can we talk? The family. That was the first time Ethan had called me in almost 10 years, and somehow he was already speaking on behalf of everyone else. What exactly does that mean? I asked. The line went quiet. I'll explain later. That immediately irritated me. You called me. I know. You tell me you're in liver failure. I know. And now you won't explain why you need me? He sighed heavily. I'm exhausted, Lena. For a second, I almost felt bad. Then a memory hit me so hard it felt like someone had opened a door I'd spent years trying to keep shut. Because Ethan's call wasn't bringing back old family memories. It was bringing back one specific day, the day everything changed. I was 18. A few months earlier, my grandfather had passed away. Losing him hurt more than I expected. He was the one person who always believed in me. When I talked about college or someday opening my own clinic, he listened like those dreams actually mattered. One afternoon, Mom asked me to sit down in the kitchen. Dad was already there. Neither of them looked comfortable. We need to talk about Grandpa's inheritance, Dad said. At first I smiled. Grandpa had told me before he died that he'd set aside $45,000 for me. Not enough to make me rich, but enough to help me build a future. I thought this was just paperwork. Instead, Dad looked at me and said, "The money's gone." I honestly thought I'd misheard him. What? It's already been used. I looked from him to Mom. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither of them looked confused. Only guilty. My stomach dropped. Used for what? Dad answered immediately. Ethan's tuition. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I remember staring at him, waiting for the rest of the explanation, waiting for the part where he said they were joking. It never came. You used Grandpa's money? I asked. Mom wiped her eyes. It was a difficult decision. No. A difficult decision is choosing between two bad options. My voice was already shaking. This wasn't your money. Dad's jaw tightened. We did what we thought was best. I looked toward the hallway and saw Ethan standing there. That hurt almost as much as the news itself, because he wasn't shocked. He already knew. Everyone knew except me. You knew about this? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. The room suddenly felt very small. I wasn't just losing money. I was realizing I'd been the last person told about a decision that affected my entire future. You stole my inheritance. Dad stood up immediately. We did not steal anything. You spent $45,000 that Grandpa left to me. It helped your brother. Every answer made it worse. I kept waiting for an apology. One sentence. One acknowledgement that what they did was wrong. It never came. Mom cried quietly. Ethan looked at the floor. Dad stayed completely firm. We made the right choice. No, I said. You made the choice you wanted. For the first time, Dad's expression hardened. Then he looked directly at me and said the sentence I've never forgotten. The sentence that followed me for the next 11 years. You'll recover from this. I stared at him. What does that mean? He folded his arms. It means you're stronger than Ethan. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And then he said the words that finally destroyed whatever trust I still had left. His future is more important right now. He's the one this family is counting on. Nobody said anything after that. Not Mom, not Ethan, not even me. Because honestly, I didn't know what to say. How do you argue with a parent who just admitted your dreams mattered less than your siblings? I remember grabbing my backpack and heading for the door. Mom called after me. "Lena, please." I didn't stop. Dad didn't try to stop me either. That was probably what hurt most. For weeks, the house felt different. Not louder, not colder, just different. Like everyone had silently agreed to move on from what happened. Everyone except me. Dad acted as if the conversation was over. Mom tried pretending things were normal. Ethan avoided me whenever possible. The money was gone. The decision had been made. And apparently I was supposed to accept it. I couldn't. A month after graduation, I packed everything I owned into an old second-hand sedan and left. No dramatic speech. No family meeting. I loaded my boxes while my parents watched from the porch. Mom cried. Dad kept his arms crossed. I remember looking at Ethan one last time. Part of me expected him to say something. Anything. An apology. A thank you. An acknowledgement that he knew what had happened. Instead, he looked away. That was the last real conversation we had for years. Life got hard almost immediately. Harder than I'd expected. I rented a tiny apartment above a laundromat because it was the cheapest place I could find. The walls were thin enough to hear conversations through them. Some months I had to choose between replacing worn-out shoes or adding extra money to my savings account. I worked wherever people would hire me. Reception desk at a medical clinic, weekend restaurant shifts, administrative assistant jobs, whatever paid. Sometimes 2 jobs at once, a few times 3. I was tired constantly. There were nights I'd come home after midnight and still spend another hour studying for certification courses. Not because I enjoyed it, because I didn't have another option. The inheritance would have made everything easier. That thought crossed my mind more often than I like admitting. Every student loan payment, every rent increase, every unexpected expense, $45,000 could have changed all of it, but dwelling on that never paid the bills. So I kept moving. One thing stayed with me through those years. A letter from Grandpa. It wasn't long, just a handwritten note he'd given me before he passed away. Whenever things got rough, I'd pull it out and read it. The paper became worn around the edges over time. His message never changed. He believed I could build something meaningful. Strangely enough, that mattered. More than I realized. A couple years passed. Then a few more. Slowly, things started improving. I finished additional training, got accepted into a physical therapy program, graduated, passed my licensing exam. The day I received my certification, I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes just staring at it. Not because I was emotional, because I was exhausted. It had taken years to get there. Years. And I'd done it myself. Eventually, I joined a rehabilitation clinic. For the first time since leaving home, I wasn't constantly worried about money. I had health insurance, a stable paycheck, patients who trusted me, friends who knew me for who I was instead of who my family expected me to be. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every now and then, Mom would send a text. "Happy birthday, Merry Christmas, hope you're doing well." I usually replied with something short. Sometimes I didn't reply at all. Dad almost never contacted me. Ethan never did. That silence became normal. Years went by that way. The distance stopped feeling temporary. It became permanent. Or at least I thought it had. One afternoon, one of my coworkers was finishing paperwork beside me when she smiled and said, "You always seem calm. What's your secret?" I laughed. If I tell you, it'll stop working. She rolled her eyes. The conversation moved on. Just another ordinary day. Another ordinary week. The kind of life I'd spent years building. No family drama, no arguments, no disappointments. Just work, friends, and a future I finally felt proud of. Then my phone lit up while I was eating dinner. One name appeared on the screen. A name I hadn't expected to see. Ethan. And suddenly, 11 years of distance didn't feel very far away anymore. The hospital felt colder than I expected. Not physically, just emotionally. I checked in at the front desk and followed the directions to Ethan's floor. Every step felt strange. For years, I'd imagined what it might be like seeing my family again. A hospital wasn't on the list. Mom spotted me first. She stood so quickly her coffee nearly tipped over. Lena. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Hi, Mom. For a second, neither of us knew what to do. Then she gave me a careful hug. I let it happen. It felt awkward. Not bad. Just unfamiliar. When she stepped back, she looked exhausted. Thank you for coming. Before I could answer, Dad walked out of Ethan's room. Our eyes met. Neither of us smiled. Hello, Lena. Hi. That was the entire conversation. 11 years of distance reduced to one word. Mom quickly pointed toward the room. He's awake. I took a breath and walked inside. The sight stopped me cold. Ethan looked nothing like the brother I remembered. He'd always been energetic, loud, confident. Now he looked tired. Really tired. His face was thinner. His skin looked unhealthy. Machines beeped quietly beside his bed. For a moment, I forgot every argument we'd ever had. He looked up and managed a weak smile. You came. You sounded terrible on the phone. A small laugh escaped him. Good. At least I still have that. The joke wasn't great, but it broke some of the tension. I pulled up a chair. For a few minutes, we talked about random things. My job. The city. Anything except the obvious. Eventually, I asked the question neither of us wanted to discuss. How bad is it? His smile disappeared. Bad. I waited. He stared at the blanket. The doctors are running out of options. That answer landed heavily. Not because it was dramatic. Because of how quietly he said it. A knock interrupted us. A doctor entered and introduced himself. He reviewed Ethan's condition, explaining years of liver damage and how quickly things had worsened recently. Most of it made sense. Then the conversation changed direction. The doctor looked at me. We're evaluating potential living donors. I frowned. Donors? He nodded. A healthy donor can provide a portion of their liver. In many cases, both people recover well. The room suddenly became very quiet. I already knew where this was heading. We normally begin with close family members, he continued. There it was. The real reason for the phone call. The doctor spent several minutes explaining compatibility tests, risks, recovery time, and evaluation procedures. I listened carefully, but I also watched Ethan. For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely frightened, not embarrassed, not guilty, scared. His hands trembled slightly. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. And something shifted inside me. I wasn't looking at the brother who had received every advantage. I was looking at a man who was terrified he might die. The doctor eventually left the room. Nobody spoke immediately. Then Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. Relief appeared on her face. The kind of relief people show when they think a problem has already been solved. I knew you'd come. I looked at her. What does that mean? She blinked. It means you're going to help him. I turned toward Dad. He nodded as if the decision had already been made. No discussion, no questions, no acknowledgement of the past. Just an expectation. Dad leaned forward and opened the folder the doctor had left behind. The donor testing can start right away. Dad said it so casually, like we were scheduling a dental appointment. Not discussing major surgery, not discussing an organ. I stared at him. That's a pretty big assumption. The room went quiet. Mom's expression immediately changed. What do you mean? I mean, nobody has asked what I actually want. Dad frowned. This isn't about what anyone wants. It's a medical emergency. There it was. The same tone, the same certainty, the same belief that his decision was the only one that mattered. I looked at Ethan. He seemed uncomfortable. Really uncomfortable. For the first time since I'd arrived, he spoke up. Dad. But Dad continued. The doctors need to move quickly. And somehow you've already decided my answer. Mom jumped in before things escalated. Lena, we're just trying to save your brother. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because nobody seemed to hear what they were saying. Every sentence focused on Ethan. Every sentence focused on saving him. Nobody had asked how I felt about any of it. Nobody had acknowledged the years between us, the inheritance, the lies, the silence. Nothing. Just expectations. A nurse knocked on the door and stepped inside. The interruption gave everyone a chance to breathe. She handed me a packet explaining the donor evaluation process, blood work, imaging, medical history, psychological screening. As a healthcare professional, none of it surprised me. I skimmed through the pages while the nurse explained everything. When she left, I closed the folder. I'll do the testing. Mom visibly relaxed. Dad nodded. Ethan looked relieved. Then I added something important. Testing isn't the same thing as agreeing to donate. The relief disappeared almost instantly. Dad's jaw tightened. Why would you test if you're not willing to help? I felt my patience slipping. Because I'm gathering information. Your brother could die. And I understand that. Then what exactly is the issue? That question finally pushed me over the edge. What is the issue? I stared at him. You really want me to answer that? The room became very still. Dad looked away first. That surprised me. Not because he felt guilty, because he knew exactly what I was talking about. Mom lowered her eyes. Ethan looked confused. Not completely confused. More like someone realizing there were pieces of the story he'd never fully understood. I stood and walked toward the window. For a moment, nobody spoke. The city lights outside were beginning to appear as the sun went down. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. What does this have to do with me being sick? His voice wasn't defensive. It sounded genuine. I turned toward him. It has to do with everything that happened before you got sick. His eyes narrowed slightly. You mean the inheritance? The fact he said it so quickly caught my attention. He remembered. Of course he remembered. Nobody forgot something like that. Mom started crying quietly. Dad looked irritated, as if the conversation itself was the problem, not the reason it existed. We don't have time for this, Dad said. I laughed once, a short laugh. That's convenient. Lena. No, seriously. I looked directly at him. For 11 years, there was never time to talk about it. Nobody responded. Because it was true. No calls, no conversations, no apology, nothing. Now suddenly, I was supposed to walk into their lives and volunteer part of my liver. The unfairness of it sat in the room like another person. Even Ethan seemed to feel it. He rubbed his face and looked toward Dad, then toward me. For the first time, I saw uncertainty there. Like maybe he wasn't completely comfortable being rescued under these circumstances. Mom wiped her eyes. Lena, please, what do you want from us? That question hung in the air. I thought about it for a moment, longer than anyone expected. Because honestly, I didn't want money. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want an argument. I wanted something much simpler. Something they had avoided for over a decade. I looked at all three of them. Then I answered. Before I make any decision about donating anything, we're going to talk about what happened. Dad immediately shook his head. I didn't let him interrupt. No excuses, no changing the subject, no pretending it wasn't a big deal. The room was silent. I took a slow breath, then said the one thing none of them expected to hear. I want all of you to admit what you did. Nobody answered. Mom looked down at her hands. Dad looked annoyed. Ethan looked confused. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Dad shook his head. This isn't the time. I almost expected that answer. It was never the time. Lena. No. I held up a hand. For 11 years, every conversation somehow avoided the same topic. Dad leaned back in his chair. His expression told me he already hated where this discussion was going. Mom quietly wiped her eyes. Ethan kept looking between us like he was watching an argument he didn't fully understand, which, honestly, might have been true. A nurse entered briefly to check Ethan's vitals. The interruption gave everyone a chance to breathe. When she left, Ethan spoke first. What exactly do you want to know? I looked at him. I want to know why nobody ever apologized. The question hung in the room. Simple, direct. Nobody answered immediately. Mom finally spoke. I thought you didn't want to hear from us. I blinked. What? She looked embarrassed. You left? You stopped answering calls. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You took my inheritance. I know. And your solution was to wait for me to get over it? Fresh tears appeared in her eyes. She didn't answer. Because there wasn't a good answer. Dad jumped in. We made a difficult decision. There it was again. That phrase. The same one he'd been using for over a decade. I laughed quietly. You keep saying difficult decision. It was. For who? Dad's jaw tightened. Neither of us looked away. The tension in the room felt familiar, like we'd somehow stepped backward 11 years. Then Ethan surprised me. Dad. Dad looked over. Ethan frowned. Just answer her. The room became quiet again. Dad clearly wasn't expecting that. Neither was I. For the first time all day, Ethan wasn't sitting on the sidelines. Dad sighed heavily. We already talked about this years ago. No, I said. You talked. Everyone else listened. Mom nodded slightly. The movement was small, but I noticed it. So did Dad. His frustration became visible immediately. You all act like I was the only person involved. Nobody responded. Because he wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't innocent. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Then he looked directly at me. I need to ask something. I crossed my arms. Okay. Did Grandpa really leave that money specifically for you? The question caught me off guard. I stared at him. You don't know? He slowly shook his head. Not confidently, almost awkwardly. Dad always said it was family money. The room suddenly felt different. I looked at Mom. She looked away. I looked at Dad. His face hardened immediately. And suddenly I realized something. Ethan hadn't known everything. He knew the money paid for college. He knew I'd left. But maybe he never knew the whole story. Maybe he only knew the version Dad told him. I sat down again. What exactly were you told? Ethan looked uncomfortable. That Grandpa wanted the money used wherever it would help most. I stared at him. Then I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it explained so much. Years of silence, years of distance, years of resentment. And somehow Ethan had been living with an entirely different version of events. He looked genuinely unsettled. You mean that's not true? Nobody answered. Not immediately. Dad looked furious now. Mostly because the conversation was slipping out of his control. Mom finally whispered, Your grandfather left it for Lena. Ethan slowly turned toward her. His face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough to tell me he was processing something he hadn't expected to hear. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ethan looked back at me. I'm sorry. The words were quiet, almost hesitant. But they were the first apology anyone in that family had given me in 11 years. I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me appreciated it. Part of me was angry it had taken this long. Part of me wondered what else nobody had told him. Eventually, I stood. I need some air. Mom started to ask where I was going, then stopped herself. I grabbed my bag and headed toward the door. Halfway out of the room, another thought surfaced. A memory. Not a clear one, just a detail I'd almost forgotten. Something Grandpa had shown me not long before he died. Something connected to the inheritance. Something that might still exist. I stopped walking, then turned back toward them. I'm going to the old house. Dad immediately frowned. What for? I looked at him for a second, then answered honestly. To find something that should have been found a long time ago. The old house looked smaller than I remembered. Funny how that happens. When you're a kid, everything feels huge. Then you come back years later and realize most of it existed that way, only in your memory. Mom met me in the driveway. She'd apparently left the hospital before I arrived. Neither of us mentioned it. She simply held up a spare key. I never threw it away. I took it. Thanks. For a second it felt like she wanted to say something else. An apology. An explanation. Maybe both. Instead, she just nodded. I'll wait outside. The front door opened with the same creak I remembered from high school. Some things really never change. The air inside carried that familiar smell of old wood and storage boxes. I stood in the entryway for a moment. Not because I was emotional, because memories kept hitting from every direction. Family dinners, homework at the kitchen table, Grandpa stopping by unexpectedly with coffee and stories. Back then, I thought this house was home. I slowly walked toward my old bedroom. Most of my things were gone. A few shelves remained. Some forgotten boxes sat in the closet. Nothing important, at least not at first. For nearly an hour, I searched through drawers, storage bins, and old paperwork. No luck. I started wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the memory wasn't real. Maybe I was chasing something that no longer existed. Then I found an old cedar chest tucked beneath a pile of blankets. I hadn't seen it in years. The sight immediately triggered a memory. Grandpa. The last summer before he died, he'd been sitting on the edge of my bed holding several folders. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention. I was 17. Paperwork was the most boring thing imaginable. Now I wished I'd paid closer attention. I opened the chest. Inside were photo albums, school records, old greeting cards, and at the very bottom, a weathered manila folder. My pulse immediately sped up. I sat on the floor and opened it. The first few pages were financial documents. Nothing unusual. Then I found a letter. Not handwritten. Typed. Signed. My grandfather's signature sat at the bottom. I started reading. Halfway through, I stopped. Then read the paragraph again. Slower. Just to make sure. The language couldn't have been clearer. The funds were intended specifically for me, not the family. Not educational expenses in general, not whichever grandchild needed help most. Me. Directly. By name. I sat there staring at the page. For years, Dad had framed the situation as a difficult family decision, a gray area, something open to interpretation. This wasn't. There was no interpretation. Grandpa's wishes had been written down in black and white. The anger I'd been carrying for years suddenly felt different. Heavier. Because now there was proof. Actual proof. Not memories. Not arguments. Proof. I kept reading. Tucked behind the letter was another note. This one handwritten. Definitely Grandpa's. The sight of his handwriting hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't seen it in years. The note wasn't about money. Not really. It talked about independence, confidence, building my own future. Near the end, he wrote something that stopped me completely. Don't let anyone convince you your dreams matter less than someone else's. I had to put the paper down. For a few seconds, I just sat there, staring at the floor, trying not to think about how accurately he'd predicted what would happen. Eventually, I gathered everything into the folder. When I stepped outside, Mom looked up from the porch. One glance at my face told her I found something. What is it? I handed her the typed letter. She read silently. The longer she read, the worse her expression became. By the time she finished, tears were already running down her cheeks. Oh God. That was all she said. No defense. No explanation. Just 3 words. For the first time, I think she was looking at the situation exactly as I had experienced it. Not as a mother, not as a wife, as someone reading the facts. She handed the papers back carefully. What are you going to do? I slid the documents into my bag, then looked toward the road, toward the hospital, toward the conversation everyone had avoided for 11 years. I'm taking these to Ethan. Mom swallowed hard. And your father? I zipped the bag closed. He needs to see them too. Then I walked to my car carrying the folder that should have ended the argument years ago. Dad was already in Ethan's room when I walked back in. Mom arrived a few minutes later. For the first time since I'd returned to their lives, all 4 of us were in the same room with nowhere else to be. No distractions, no excuses. I placed the folder on Ethan's tray table. Dad immediately noticed it. What's that? The thing we've been arguing about for 11 years. Nobody moved. I opened the folder and pulled out the letter. Then I handed it directly to Ethan. Read it. He looked confused, but took the pages. The room stayed silent while he read. Halfway through, his expression changed. By the end, he looked stunned. This says Grandpa left the money specifically to Lena. I nodded. Keep reading. He read the handwritten note next. His eyes lingered on the final lines. When he finally looked up, he didn't look at me. He looked at Dad. You told me it was family money. Dad crossed his arms. It benefited the family. That's not what I asked. The tension immediately jumped. Ethan rarely challenged Dad when we were younger. Seeing it now felt strange. Dad glanced toward the window. It was complicated. No, I said quietly. It really wasn't. Mom started crying before anyone else spoke. Not dramatic crying, just exhausted tears. The kind people hold back for years until they can't anymore. She covered her face for a moment, then finally looked at me. I'm sorry. Nobody interrupted her, not even Dad. I'm so sorry, Lena. Her voice shook. I knew it was wrong. The room became completely still. Mom wiped her eyes. I kept telling myself we were helping Ethan. I kept telling myself it was temporary. Then too much time passed. I said nothing. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was admitting something. Maybe for the first time. Her shoulders slumped. We took away opportunities you should have had. Another tear rolled down her cheek. And when you left, I was so focused on holding the family together that I never stopped to realize we'd already broken it. Ethan lowered his head. I could see the guilt all over his face. Mom looked at me again. You worked for everything. Every job. Every class. Every step. She swallowed hard. You shouldn't have had to do it alone. For several seconds, nobody spoke. I won't lie. Hearing those words mattered. Not because they erased anything. Nothing could. But for years, I'd felt like I was screaming into a void. Now somebody was finally listening. Ethan quietly handed the documents back to me. I didn't know all of this. His voice sounded rough. I knew where the money came from. I knew you were angry. He looked ashamed. I didn't know Grandpa specifically left it to you. I nodded slowly. Part of me believed him now. The reaction seemed genuine. The room might have stayed calm if Dad had simply remained silent. Instead, he sighed heavily. A frustrated sigh. The kind he'd used my entire childhood whenever someone disagreed with him. Everyone turned toward him. Dad rubbed his forehead. Then he said the one thing nobody wanted to hear. I already admitted we took the money. The room instantly tightened again. Mom stared at him. Ethan looked confused. I already knew where this was going. Dad pointed toward the documents. Maybe I handled it badly. Maybe. The word hung in the air. But Ethan got an education. Nobody answered. Dad continued. He had opportunities because of that decision. I felt my jaw tighten. Mom looked horrified. Dennis! But he wasn't finished. I regret how much it hurt you. He looked directly at me, and then he delivered the sentence that brought us right back to the beginning. But I still don't know if the decision itself was completely wrong. Silence. Absolute silence. Even Ethan looked shocked. Mom stared at Dad like she couldn't believe he had actually said it out loud. I sat there holding Grandpa's letter in my hands. For the first time all evening, nobody knew what to say next. But I still don't know if the decision itself was completely wrong. The words just sat there. Nobody moved. Nobody rushed to defend him. Even Mom looked stunned. I stared at Dad for several seconds, trying to understand how he could read Grandpa's letter, hear Mom's apology, see where everyone had ended up, and still say that. Finally, I spoke. You really believe that? Dad exhaled slowly. I believe I was trying to protect my son. The answer hit differently than I expected. Not because it made me angrier, because it sounded tired. For the first time all evening, he didn't sound certain. He sounded old. Ethan shifted in his hospital bed. Dad? Dad looked at him. You need to stop saying it like that. The room went quiet again. Ethan shook his head. You keep talking like I was some investment that had to work out. Dad frowned. That's not what I mean. Isn't it? Ethan looked down at the blanket. Then he laughed softly. It wasn't a happy laugh. If that's what you were betting on, you picked the wrong kid. Nobody knew how to respond, including Dad. Ethan rubbed his face. I graduated. He shrugged. Then I bounced between jobs for years. His voice sounded frustrated, mostly with himself. I ignored my health. Mom started crying again. Ethan continued anyway. I kept assuming I'd deal with everything later. He looked toward me. And while I was doing that, you were actually building a life. I didn't say anything, partly because I wasn't sure he was talking to me, partly because he wasn't wrong. Dad stared at the floor. For once, he had no argument ready. Ethan took a slow breath. You sacrificed her future for me. The words landed hard, especially because they came from him. And I didn't even do anything worthwhile with it. Damn it, Ethan, Dad muttered. No. Ethan shook his head. We keep avoiding the truth. He looked directly at his father. I benefited from what happened. Then he looked at me. And I should have talked to you years ago. For a second I saw the kid from the hallway 11 years earlier, the one who looked uncomfortable while our parents explained where my inheritance went. The difference was that now he wasn't looking away. I was a coward, he said quietly. That one surprised me. Nobody in my family used words like that, especially not about themselves. The room fell silent. Dad remained seated. His hands were clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Eventually he looked at me. Not Ethan, not Mom. Me. And something about his expression had changed. The defensiveness was still there, but it wasn't carrying the whole conversation anymore. For the first time, there was something else. Regret. I thought I was making the practical choice. His voice sounded rough, much rougher than before. When your grandfather died, I was scared. I blinked. That wasn't what I expected. Dad looked away briefly, then continued. I looked at both of you and convinced myself Ethan needed the help more. Nobody interrupted. I told myself you were stronger. I almost laughed. I'd heard that excuse before, but this time he kept going. And eventually, I started using that as justification. The room became completely still. Dad rubbed his forehead. I wasn't thinking about fairness. There it was. The first truly honest thing he'd said all night. Maybe all decade. I was thinking about my fears. Mom lowered her head. Ethan stared quietly. Dad finally looked at me again. I chose Ethan because I was afraid he'd fail without help. His voice cracked slightly. And I assumed you'd survive no matter what happened. A long silence followed. The strange thing was that hearing it didn't make me feel victorious. It just made me tired. Because I'd spent 11 years waiting for an explanation. And when it finally arrived, it wasn't some complicated mystery. It was fear, bad judgment, and a father convincing himself that one child could absorb a loss better than the other. Dad swallowed hard. I was wrong. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. The words felt too important to rush past. Then Ethan looked toward me. Mom looked toward me. Dad did too. The arguments were gone. The excuses were gone. The secrets were gone. For the first time in 11 years, everyone was sitting in the same truth. And suddenly the room felt strangely quiet, because there was only one question left, and nobody else could answer it. Every pair of eyes in that hospital room was looking at me. The strange thing was, I didn't answer right away. Not because I wanted to be dramatic, because for the first time since Ethan's phone call, nobody was pressuring me. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was telling me what I should do. The choice was finally mine. I looked at Ethan first. He seemed to understand exactly what I was thinking. Before I could say anything, he shook his head. You don't owe me this. The sentence surprised everyone, including Mom and Dad. Ethan gave a weak smile. I mean it. His voice was quiet but steady. I don't want you making this decision because of guilt. Nobody spoke. He looked down at his hands. You already gave up enough because of me. For years, I had imagined conversations like this. Arguments, accusations, maybe even revenge. Instead, I found myself sitting in a hospital room listening to my brother tell me I didn't owe him anything. Life is weird sometimes. A few days passed. The donor evaluation process started. Blood tests, scans, meetings with specialists. More paperwork than I thought possible. The hospital staff repeatedly reminded me that I could stop at any point. No explanations required. No pressure. Just a choice. One afternoon, a transplant coordinator sat across from me. If you're a match, she said, you still have every right to say no. I nodded. I understand. And I did. That conversation mattered, because it forced me to ask myself a difficult question. If I agreed to this, why? For my parents? No, that wasn't enough. For guilt? Definitely not. For the inheritance? Nothing could change the past. The answer took longer to find than I expected. A few evenings later, I was sitting alone in my apartment rereading Grandpa's handwritten note, the same one I'd carried for years, the same one that survived every move and every bad period of my life. I stopped on the final lines, the ones about believing in myself, the ones about not letting anyone define my worth. And suddenly something clicked. Helping Ethan wouldn't erase what happened. Refusing wouldn't erase it either. The past was already written. The only thing I could control was the person I wanted to be moving forward. A week later, the results came back. I was a compatible donor. The doctors were optimistic. As optimistic as transplant surgeons ever allow themselves to be. I asked for some time. Not because I was unsure anymore, because I wanted the decision to feel fully mine. When I finally returned to the hospital, everyone looked nervous, even Dad, especially Dad. I sat down beside Ethan's bed. He studied my face for clues. Mom looked like she hadn't slept. Nobody said a word. I almost laughed. For a family that spent years arguing, we suddenly couldn't speak. Finally, I broke the silence. "I'm doing it." Mom immediately covered her mouth. Tears appeared before she could stop them. Dad looked down at the floor. Ethan just stared at me. For several seconds, he didn't react at all. Then he nodded slowly. Not like someone receiving a gift, like someone receiving responsibility. "Thank you." That was it. No promises, no dramatic speeches. Just thank you. And honestly, that meant more. Because for the first time in our lives, neither of us was pretending. The following days felt strangely different. The tension didn't disappear, but something shifted. Dad stopped giving instructions. Mom stopped trying to force conversations. Ethan stopped asking for anything. Instead, people listened, respected boundaries, asked questions instead of making assumptions. It wasn't a perfect family reunion, far from it, but it was real. One evening, as we sat together in Ethan's room, he looked over and said, "You know, if this works, I owe you the worst birthday gifts for the rest of your life." I laughed. A real laugh. The first one I'd had around my family in years. "That's your big promise?" "It's all I've got." Even Dad smiled at that. A small one. But still, progress. Then the surgery date arrived. Suddenly, everything became very practical. Pre-op instructions, final testing, consent forms, schedules, timelines. The kind of details that make a huge event feel surprisingly ordinary. Until it isn't. I barely slept the night before. Not because I regretted my decision, because surgery is surgery. You can understand the statistics. You can trust the doctors. You can prepare as much as possible. None of that removes uncertainty. Early the next morning, a nurse woke me before sunrise. The hallway outside my room was quiet. The hospital felt different at that hour. Almost peaceful. I changed into a hospital gown and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for transport. A few floors away, Ethan was doing the same thing. Both of us knew what was coming. Neither of us knew how it would end. The last thing I remember before anesthesia was Ethan's bed being rolled next to mine for a minute. He looked exhausted. Honestly, so did I. He managed a weak smile. "Still time to change your mind?" I laughed. "You're the one who needs a liver." "Fair enough." A nurse interrupted us, checked a few things, and then we were taken in different directions. A few hours later, everything hurt. That was my first clear thought when I woke up. A nurse noticed I was awake. "Welcome back." I tried to answer. It sounded terrible. She smiled anyway. The next couple of days felt like a blur of medication, doctors, and very slow walks down hospital hallways. The first thing I asked about was Ethan. "He's doing well," the nurse told me. I didn't realize how worried I was until I heard those words. Good. A few days later, I finally saw him. He looked awful. I probably did too. But he was alive. That mattered. "Hey," he said. "Hey." Neither of us had the energy for some huge emotional speech. He looked at me for a moment. "Thank you." I nodded. "Take care of yourself this time." A small smile appeared on his face. "I will." Recovery turned out to be harder than I expected. Not just physically, emotionally too. My parents visited often. At first, everything felt awkward. Years of hurt don't disappear overnight. There were long silences, careful conversations. Mom apologized more than once. Dad struggled with it differently. One afternoon, he showed up with coffee and sat beside me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he handed me a cup. "I don't expect you to forgive me quickly." I looked at him. He stared at the floor. "You deserved better from me." That was it. No excuses, no arguments, just the truth. It didn't erase the past, but it mattered. Months passed. Life slowly settled into something new. Ethan followed every medical instruction the doctors gave him. He stopped taking things for granted. One day he called me, not because he needed help, not because there was a crisis, just because he wanted to grab lunch. For us, that was a bigger step than it sounds. Mom and I talked more often, too. Sometimes about important things, sometimes about nothing at all. Dad remained Dad, quiet, a little awkward, trying harder than he knew how to say. The inheritance never came back. The opportunities I lost never came back either. Nobody pretended otherwise. But something finally changed. The truth was out in the open. Nobody denied it anymore. Nobody expected me to pretend it hadn't hurt. For years, I thought donating part of my liver would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. It wasn't. The hardest thing was standing up for myself and refusing to accept being treated like I mattered less. The surgery took a few hours. Finding my voice took 11 years. And somehow, that was what finally gave our family a chance to start healing. Not because everything became perfect. It didn't. Some conversations are still awkward. Some scars are still there. That's real life. But healing finally became possible the moment everyone stopped running from the truth. If this story connected with you, maybe because you've experienced favoritism, betrayal, or a difficult family relationship, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel a little less alone. And if you enjoy family drama stories with real emotions and meaningful lessons, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories here on Vans Rock Stories. Take care of yourselves, and thanks for spending this time with me.